So now we have a truly wonderful last-minute bonus guest for this evening, Representative Jamie Raskin. You knew that before I told you. Representative Raskin is going to be familiar to every single one of you for his work on January 6th accountability, but I got to tell you, I've known him for a long time, and he has been a singular leader and thinker on what to do with the Constitution to make our lives better. Jamie Raskin represents Maryland's 8th Congressional District. He is the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee. He is a lawyer. He's a constitutional law professor. In short, Representative Jamie Raskin is the perfect cherry on top guest for this final lap around originalism and the Supreme Court and the future of American democracy. Welcome.
Dahlia, it's a thrill to be with you, and I know we've been trying to do this for a long time, and it seems like either impeachment or an insurrection or a coup or something kept getting in the way.
There's always something.
There's always something. And today is Election Day in Maryland. I hope everybody voted. So, yeah. That's real power.
That is real power. So I want to start by saying I've always thought about you as one of the very few bridge people in Congress. And you connect so deftly, I think, the abstractions of the law and the Constitution to the abstraction that is democracy itself. And then you connect all that to a public that has just largely been taught that this stuff is too technical for them to care about or too sacred for them to intervene in. So our entire originalism series was born of a need to make this thing that is originalism, this thing that is the Supreme Court and a 6-3 supermajority, transparent. It was really conceived of as a way to say to people, holy cow, care about this thing. And you've been doing that for a very long time. And so I would love to hear you just tell me your thumbnail answer to how do you explain to voters that the Supreme Court is the single most urgent thing that they don't quite know how to care about?
Well, one way to do it is to look at like what the Democrats are campaigning for in this campaign. We want to try to repair the damage inflicted on the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder, where the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act and the pre-clearance mechanism. We're trying to restore women's reproductive freedom in America by passing a federal law that would codify Roe versus Wade. I can give you a whole bunch of examples like that, but the point is we're basically trying to repair the damage that's been wrought upon us by the Supreme Court. And if we win Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate and we defend the White House against nihilism and authoritarianism, and we succeed in doing that, all of it, and we pass the laws we're talking about, all of it could still be taken away by the Supreme Court. Take Roe versus Wade. If we say we're going to use our powers under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment to codify Roe versus Wade, to just restore a woman's right to choose in consultation with her physician within the first trimester and subject to reasonable regulation in the second trimester, the Supreme Court might just say, Congress does not have the power under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. It is not congruent and proportional to the underlying constitutional right, which we just eviscerated in the Dobbs decision. And they could do the exact same thing in our attempt to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. They could simply say, you might think that you're enforcing and vindicating an existing constitutional right, but you're not. You're expanding that right because we've already devoured it in Shelby County versus Holder. So the Supreme Court is right at the center, and as I assume you've been able to prove in your series, they will use the rhetoric and the methodology of originalism when it suits them to undo a right they don't believe in or to establish a government of power that they want. But if originalism doesn't work, they will choose another methodological technique to get to where they want to go. So I guess the way that I explain it to people is fall out of love with the Supreme Court quickly, okay? Because if you look at American history, for the vast majority of our history, the Supreme Court has been a profoundly conservative and reactionary institution. All the way from the founding to the Civil War, what did the Supreme Court ever do for enslaved people in this country? Nothing, other than in the Dred Scott decision, cement into place the system of slavery and say that the African and the descendants of Africans have no rights that the white man is bound to respect. And they used, at that point, that was an originalist interpretation, mostly saying if you look at the original statutes in most of the states, the African Americans had no rights, and therefore they could not have any rights. There were dissenting opinions that were strong opinions to that. Even after the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments, what did the Supreme Court do other than gut the meaning of those amendments? And in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, essentially uphold American apartheid, Jim Crow apartheid. And it was not until the 1950s, until the Warren Court, where we got decisions like the white primary line of authority and Brown versus Board and Gideon versus Wainwright, and then eventually Roe versus Wade. There was about a 2-decade period that created the halo around the Supreme Court. And then it immediately went away again with the Burger Court and the Rehnquist Court and the Roberts Court. So the Supreme Court is not going to save us, my friends. We're going to have to do that, which is why I just got back from Texas and New Hampshire. I'm all over the country. It's going to take a popular upsurge in America to win our rights back. Yeah.
So one of the big complaints this year for listeners to Amicus, for people who think deeply about the rule of law, is this question of whether the machinery of the law, as currently constituted, is adequate and fast enough to hold Donald Trump accountable. And we are now seeing 3 of the 4 criminal cases being dragged out, sometimes as a result of like legal arcana and technicalities and who the judge is. And we're seeing at this moment Donald Trump sitting in a courtroom in New York, and he's either going to be held to account for unlawful hush money payments to influence an election, or he's not. So what do you tell people who feel that, like, dude, I was all in for the law, but the strictures and the protections of the legal system have gone from holding Donald Trump accountable to keeping him off the hook? Can law keep up with the creeping, now speeding forces of, as you said, nihilism, illiberalism, authoritarianism, or is law lacing up its sneakers while those things lap us again and again?
I mean, the law has got to exist in our hearts and our minds. And, you know, I don't know everybody you've had in your series on originalism, but I might be the closest that you find to somebody who's a real originalist, because the way I see it is that, I mean, if you read the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the subsequent amendments the way I do, the vast majority of the amendments we've had since the original Bill of Rights, the vast majority of those 17 have been democratizing amendments, suffrage extending, equality deepening amendments, right? So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment gives us equal protection and due process against the states. The 15th Amendment bans race discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment shifts the mode of election of the U.S. senators from the legislatures to the people. The 19th Amendment doubles the franchise in America by giving women the right to vote. The 23rd Amendment gives people in D.C. the right to participate, at least in presidential elections. The 24th Amendment bans poll taxes and removes wealth as a barrier to participation. And the 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18. The whole trajectory of our constitutional growth has been towards greater democracy and greater inclusion. But that is not an original understanding that the vast majority of the people at the Supreme Court will accept. And they do not give you an original interpretation, an original understanding of the Equal Protection Clause, which occasioned a revolution in our jurisprudence. So, but I guess my answer to your question, my honest answer is I was shocked. You know, even as jaded as I've become about the people who work across the street from me, okay? Even as jaded as I've become about the Supreme Court, I was shocked at what they did in Anderson versus Trump. The plain language of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says that anyone who is sworn an oath to support the Constitution of the United States who violates the oath by engaging in insurrection or rebellion shall never be allowed to hold federal or state office again. It's in the plain language. And that's textualism, right? You know, there's a difference between textualism and originalism. Textualism says we can figure it out from the language itself. But if you have to take an extra step and go to an originalist analysis, do it, because you will find that Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans who brought Section 3 of the 14th Amendment came in with a far broader proposal over on the House side. What they said was, anybody who's engaged in insurrection or rebellion shall never be allowed to vote again. Anybody, not just former elected officials. It got over to the Senate, and they said, whoa, that goes real far. You're talking about disenfranchising millions of people for life for participating in the Confederate insurrection or another future rebellion. We want to zero in on the most culpable class of offenders. So what's the bullseye? People who've sworn an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, who violate the oath by engaging in insurrection and rebellion, and even those people will not be disenfranchised. You still have the essential attribute of citizenship, which is the right to vote. You can just never hold office again. And that's what the Colorado Supreme Court found after 5 days of fact-finding. And the justices, because they thought it would be too controversial, just threw their hands up and said, oh no, the states can't do that, and Congress has got to do it. Oh, and by the way, it's not a political question. It's not really up to Congress. Send it back to us to make sure that, you know, we run it through the straitjacket of our Federalist Society analysis. I mean, come on, you know, and then you get, and then you turn on TV and you get all these conservative pundits saying, well, why should he be the only person in America who can't run for president? Really? Really? Because there are 75 million people, I bet there's some of them in this room, raise your hand if you're one of them, who can't run because you're not 35 years old. Anybody out there? How about anybody born in another country who's a U.S. citizen now? You can't run for office either. How about you've already done 2 terms in office like President Obama? You can't run. You can't run. There's more than 100 million people who can't run for president in the United States. And if you think about all of those categories of disqualification for serving as president, the one that is most morally, legally, and politically defensible, although they're all in the Constitution, so they're all part of the law, the one that is the most defensible is you've chosen to set yourself at war against the Constitution itself. There's like 5 or 6 people in that category. So call me at least a 14th Amendment originalist, because that's what I am. And you know, and I will say, because I was so thrilled to get your invitation, and I started thinking a little bit more about your topic, which is so fascinating. You know, like on the Second Amendment, for example, in the Heller decision, which is a D.C. case, which overturned D.C.'s ban on handguns, that was not an originalist analysis at all. It had nothing to do with the original intent and so on. But then when you get to the Bruen case, you know, Justice Thomas and Justice Alito, well, they want to look at the history of what kinds of laws existed at the time of the writing of the Second Amendment. They don't want to look at what kinds of guns were in existence at the time the Second Amendment was written, because at that point, the only gun you'd be allowed to hold under the new magical individual right you have under their jurisprudence is the flintstock musket, okay? But they're not stuck in history there, but they do want us to be stuck in history when it comes to what kinds of laws are allowed. So if there's a law saying that a domestic violence perpetrator can't have a gun, they want to say, well, were there any laws like that back in the 18th century? Well, what do you think? You know, and so they turn it on and they turn it off like air conditioning, you know?
So I'm hearing your answer to my, is law adequate to the task of holding Trump accountable? I'm hearing your answer to be, well, yeah, if the Supreme Court lets them, it really does turn on what the Supreme Court says about holding Trump accountable. And you make this, I think, essential point that those of us who looked at, Anderson, the Colorado case, and the Trump immunity cases, and we stroked our chins and said there's going to be a grand bargain, right? Trump will lose, on immunity, and he'll win on Colorado, but it's all going to come out in the wash because the court really cares about Donald Trump and protecting democracy.
Yeah.
And the really chilling thing for those of us who told ourselves a story about the court caring, both about its sort of reputational interest as a serious entity, but also caring that there be free and fair elections after 2024, court doesn't seem to care. And I would love for you to give us a sense of, we certainly on this show told people we can make the court care. We're going to just be super angry, and we're going to demand ethics reform, and we're going to write angry letters, and at some point they will feel shame. Mm-hmm. And I guess what I'm asking is, please tell us we are not just beholden to a court that does not seem to care, manifestly so in the last few weeks, about the future of constitutional democracy.
You want me to tell you that?
I want you to tell me that the court cares. And Sherilyn says, tell the truth.
I never thought I would live to see the day where justices have their own billionaire sugar daddies who give them, houses and automobiles and private school tuitions. And my friend Dar Williams sings a song where she says it's a long road from law to justice, and it is a long road from law to justice. And, again, look, I was a law professor for 25 years. People come up to me in the street and they say, wait a second, you were a tenured professor of constitutional law and you went down there to work with Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert but I left for a reason, which is I fell out of love with the ideal of trying to make it work. I think it's great that people do it. I'm totally into your work and the Alliance for Justice and People for the American Way and NAACP Legal Defense Fund. More power to them. These are my allies. But to my mind, we got to organize the people in America. That's where the power comes from. And we will, if and when we win back the House and the Senate and the White House, we will look at the Supreme Court and figure out what can be done about that extremely corrupted and contaminated body. So, and I'll say one more thing about that. It's interesting. The Supreme Court, the Constitution, of course, does not fix the numerical composition of the Supreme Court, and it has changed 9 or 10 different times over the course of our history. We have 13 federal circuits. We've got 9 justices. 5 of those justices are from New York. We've got 1 for each borough, okay? We have entire federal circuits that don't have a single justice. How about we start to talk about having 13 justices on the Supreme Court, 1 from each circuit, 18-year terms. They still get life tenure because they can go and be on the district bench or the circuit bench. Each president gets 2 appointments to the court, 2 nominations to the court, guaranteed nominations. Obviously, the Senate still has to advise and consent, but it will remove some of the toxicity and the poison from the nominations if we know that each president will get 2, and we can deal with this problem. But the current Supreme Court is just a scandal. It's just a scandal. There goes.
So again, I'm hearing you say, shame is not going to get us there. We're going to need to reform the court. And it's cute to think that they're going to get embarrassed.
I tried your shame strategy, Dahlia Lithwick, after Bush versus Gore, and I wrote a book called Overruling Democracy, the Supreme Court versus the American People, and about how it was just a full frontal assault on constitutional text, on methodology, history, spirit, structure of the Constitution, the right of the people to choose their own president, all of the precedents and so on. And, yeah, it didn't shame them.
No. It was, however, an excellent book that I enjoyed very much.
I appreciate that.
So here's the thing that I really want you to answer, because I think nobody knows about what Donald Trump's legal advisors are planning to do if he wins office. And they're not secretive about it. This runs the gamut from the horrors of Project 2025 to the Comstock Act to gutting core democratic functions to gutting government as we know it, the Justice Department unrecognizable, prosecuting enemies of the people. I mean, this stuff is Orwellian, chilling shit. Sorry, people under presidential age, cover your ears. This is very, very bad. And so I would love for you to tell us how to make tangible for people who care about law and the rule of law what is coming, and that voting because Trump is sleepier than Biden or Biden is sleepier than Trump is a pretty narrow frame for the stakes of this election.
Yeah, I mean, everything's on the ballot. Democracy's on the ballot. Freedom's on the ballot. Our whole constitutional framework. Sometimes my colleagues will say to me, I had a colleague from South Carolina, a guy I liked named Trey Gowdy. I don't know if you remember him, but on his way out, he said, Raskin, you're not a bad guy. The problem with you is you're a liberal. And I said, well, you're damn right I'm a liberal. The heart of the word is liberty, and I'm a progressive because the heart of that word is progress. But my favorite thing to call myself these days is a conservative because I want to conserve the land, the air, the water, the climate system, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Labor Relations Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so, I mean, everything is on the ballot. And so I think you've got one party, which is a party that's standing up for democracy and civilization, and another party which wants to tear everything down. And look, Donald Trump already pardoned Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, Dinesh D'Souza. I mean, I could keep going for a dozen of them. That's the inner coterie of his presidential campaign. And he's running around the country saying that he will pardon the January 6th hostages. Now, a hostage is someone who has been illegally abducted by a terrorist or criminal enterprise like Hamas and held for a legal or a political ransom. The people he's talking about, there are 29 of them in D.C. jail where they go to protest for their freedom. Those 29 people are in jail for having been found guilty or having pled guilty, in most of the cases, to violently assaulting Capitol officers or Metropolitan Police Department officers with steel pipes, Confederate battle flags, Trump flags, and they're also there, some of them, for the crime of seditious conspiracy, which means conspiracy to overthrow the government of the United States. So he wants to now go and pardon the political shock troops who came and attacked our police officers as part of his most recent coup and insurrection, where they tried to get Vice President Pence to step outside of his assigned constitutional, ceremonial, ministerial role under the 12th Amendment to the Constitution to oversee the counting of the Electoral College votes, and simply to proclaim Donald Trump the president, or to reject and return enough Electoral College votes from Michigan and Pennsylvania and Arizona to declare that there was a failure of a majority in the Electoral College, and then to kick the whole thing over into so-called contingent election under the 12th Amendment, where they knew we would be voting not on the basis of one member, one vote, but one state, one vote. And the GOP controlled 27 state delegations. We had 22. Pennsylvania was tied 9-9, so they would have been just written off immediately. Even had the at-large representative from Wyoming, Liz Cheney, voted with us or voted for someone else, they still would have had 26 states. And that was the big Green Bay sweep that they were planning to nullify enough electoral college votes with this fraudulent return to the states mechanism. But then they knew under the 12th Amendment, immediately we would have to resolve into the House in order to vote. So that's what they wanted to do. Then you've got Donald Trump's lawyers running around saying he's got absolute immunity from any charges relating to a violent insurrection that he ginned up in order to support his inside coup. And they say, well, upon questioning in the D.C. Circuit, they say, well, maybe it's not absolute. If you can first impeach and convict him for it, then he could be tried later. And they actually answered the question, yes, the president could order assassination of his political rivals because he might be impeached and convicted, to which I immediately thought, having been, our lead manager in the second impeachment, I said, gee, wouldn't that give that president who just assassinated all of his political rivals an incentive to assassinate us, the people who might vote to impeach or convict him? Because then, if he stops there from being a 2/3 majority in the Senate, which has never been assembled, or if he stops himself from being impeached in the House in the first place, then he can never be prosecuted. And so they're literally making an argument for assassination and slaughter of people in the federal government. And this is where we are in 2024.
That took a turn.
Yeah.
Wasn't quite buckled in for that one. Representative Raskin, I feel like I have to ask you briefly about Clarence Thomas, because we have not fully aired in this evening's festivities the utter weirdness of having such a completely closed system that nobody who litigates a January 6th case at the Supreme Court can stand at the lectern and say, oh, by the way, that guy, he should not be here. We're in such a strange world in which this is just sort of taken for granted, both by the public and the press, and there's nothing to be done, and then he asks questions. And I guess part of your answer to this is ethics reform, right? What you said before, we can fix these problems. But are we so far through the looking glass that we just accede to this monarchic court that tells us to trust them, that they're not compromised? Yes.
Well,
And there it is.
It's the only federal court in the land that does not have a binding ethics code against it. It's the only court in the land, federal, state, or any other kind of court, that does not have a binding ethics code against it. And it shows, right? If you don't have an ethics code, you get people flying on junkets with their billionaire buddies all over the world and taking, huge cash payments for a motor coach, a house, a private school tuition. Why not? You only make, $325,000 a year. $325,000 a year, right? Is that what it is? It's like double what we make. Pay for your own damn vacation is what I want to say, My God. So, look, let's go back to the beginning. Madison did say that it is a principal element of our jurisprudence that no one should be a judge in his own cause, in his own case, right? And the Supreme Court, they're all judges in their own case. Who decides whether there's a conflict of interest? They do. And not even as to each other, each for him or herself, right? At the very least, why don't we create an ethics committee of the chief judges of all the federal circuit courts of appeal, and we could apply to them if we think there's a conflict of interest on the Supreme Court. Does that make some sense? Could we make that happen? But if you also go back to the beginning, you know, the court was not so elevated in people's esteem. And I mean, I concede it's come down a lot because these people have disgraced the institution so much. But I think we were getting to a point where people really thought, you know, there was something different about them. And, you know, one would like to think it's true. There were certain justices, you know, who did create that kind of image and idea, you know, Justices Marshall and Brennan and Brandeis, you know, but in general, though, I mean, it has been just a sordid and miserable reactionary lot. I mean, and, you know, the Dred Scott decision, alas, was authored by a Marylander, which is a bummer. I'm not going to utter, you know, so, look, we just need like a massive democratic renewal in America, and we're going to get all these fantastic young people across the country engaged in our politics, getting elected to state legislatures and the councils and the school boards and Congress and the Senate, and we're going to get new people going out as judges, and we will have a renewal when we get through this very dark authoritarian period in our life.
So, yeah, I think we can clap for renewal. We only have a quick minute left, but I did promise the audience that we would end a kind of grim 2 weeks talking about being pinned under the dead hand of originalism and the dead hand of a 6-3 supermajority. And you've talked several times about what it would mean to have we, the people, reclaim the project of constitutional democracy and interpretation. Can you just tell me what that looks like?
I mean, I had Professor Tribe in constitutional law, and like there I found both my career and my wife. I met Sarah there, and I used to go and gaze at her across the lecture hall, like here, and I thought she was looking at me, but she apparently didn't have her contact lenses on. I learned at the end of the semester. But anyway, but Tribe taught us that in a Supreme Court decision, and I think this was kind of standard con law, you know, pedagogy, that you begin with the text, the language of the Constitution, and then you look at its history, meaning its legislative history, and what were the purposes embodied in what we can determine from the constitutional history. And then we look at the subsequent cases and how they interpreted the history and the language and what we can learn from that. And you look at the ethos or the spirit of the document, and you look at the structure of the document. You can look at something called intertextualism, which is how similar ideas or words are interpreted in other parts of the Constitution. But it was very clear from what he was saying that it wasn't like there was a clear hierarchy necessarily, and it wasn't, you know, it wasn't like a, you know, how to set up your dishwasher kind of guide, like if you just followed one step to the other. Why? Because the whole process is saturated with value. It's saturated with ethics and morality and politics, which then give a particular perspective to everything, to the language, to the history, to the structure, to the spirit, and to the ethos. And this was before, you know, originalism really hit its heyday, and that was the idea, you know, when the right wing thought they were going to be a lot closer to where people were in 1787, that they wanted to try to hit rewind all the way back to then. They don't do that. They never did it for, you know, 1868, and they didn't do it for the Reconstruction amendments. They didn't want to go to that period, so they used other devices to get there. All of which is to say, all of us are human beings. None of these justices are superhuman, to say the least. But there are political, moral, ethical, social movements in American history that infuse the law, infuse the legislatures and Congress, infuse the presidency, and infuse the courts. And it's our job to create the movements that will put the Supreme Court back on the side of freedom and equality and justice and the people. So.
Sticks the landing every time. Congressman Jamie Raskin represents Maryland's 8th Congressional District. He is the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee, a veteran constitutional law professor, and according to Axios, one of the busiest men in D.C. I also just want to, on a personal note, to say how glad I am that you are well and busy and thriving.
Thank you, Dahlia.
As we say in this sort of house of worship, 120 years. Like, we want you to be doing this for a long, long time. And that is a wrap for this live edition, All Originalism All the Time, Amicus. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our amazing guests tonight, Professor Sherilyn Ifill, Justice Todd Edens, Madiba Danny, Congressman Jamie Raskin. I want to thank, in addition, hold on, I got to get through this. I also want to thank Slate's Mark Joseph Stern, who has kept me sane this year. Thank you, Mark. I will see you in the cigar bar. I want to thank Slate's Director of Media Relations and constitutionally themed mixologist, Katie Rayford, for wrangling this event with grace and finesse. I want to thank Slate's Executive Editor, Susan Matthews, who pulled this package together into an amazing piece of service journalism. I want to thank, because she always edits it out of the podcast, my producer, Sarah Birmingham, who made this event and this package what it is. And Sarah, if you edit this out, everyone here will know it. I also want to thank the divine, delightful team at 6&I, who are just a joy to work with. And above all things, I want to thank all of you for showing up here tonight to put your bodies in the fight for democracy, for justice, and for a better future for all of us. Thank you so much.